Students, welcome to this session. Today we are going to look into the topic that is kind of most fascinating ability of our nervous system, that is neuroplasticity. And in this session, we will be more focusing on how the brain and spinal cord learn and adapt after the damage. So let's start the session. So one of the most fascinating feature of our nervous system is something called that we call as at neuroplasticity. And what does it mean? It means that the brain and the spinal cord are not fixed or rigid. They may be fixed or rigid in terms of structure, in terms of their anatomy, but they are flexible in terms of reorganizing themselves. They can change their structure and the way they function based on the experience of learning and even after the injury also. So now we think about like when let's say you are learning to play piano, or maybe when you are memorize a phone number, your brain is physically rewiring itself. That is called the neuroplasticity in action. So now this property becomes even more important when there is any damage to the central nervous system, the CNS. So let's say part of the brain or maybe the spinal cord is injured. So neuroplasticity is what allows the remaining and healthy circuits to take over some of the lost function. So it helps the nervous system to adapt, to form new pathways, and to strengthening the connections that are still there, that are still intact. And in case of spinal cord, for example, let's say neuroplasticity is absolutely necessary to build detours. So to create new routes for information to bypass and damaged areas. And we know without it, recovery is not possible. So, if we concise, in short, the neuroplasticity is the engine of both learning as well as the recovery. So, that is what makes the nervous system adaptive and flexible. Now, if we see how the learning in the central nervous system is happening, particularly when the brain has uh, some damage or maybe injured. So when we think of rehabilitation after a stroke or a spinal cord injury, we normally focus only on the exercise or devices based uh, exercises or therapies. But actually what's really happening? So what really happening underneath it or in at the level of brain, that these rehabilitation technologies are tapping into the brain's neural learning mechanism. So, one of the interesting part here we can take that learning in a damaged brain is not exactly the same as the learning in healthy brain. So, in a healthy brain, motor learning, like when you learn to ride a bicycle or play a new sport, it you relies on established the new learning pathways with the existing neural network. But in damaged brain, many of those pathways are disrupted. Those are not there. So the brain has to find alternative strategies. So it may recircuit different regions, it may reorganize circuits, or it may making the connections more stronger, which are actually weaker to because of that particular injury. So all these helps in actually the recovery. And when we say motor learning, we are really talking about the broad umbrella term. It's not just one process, it involves many mechanisms working together. For example, learning a simple repetitive movement like extending your arm may rely on very different circuits compared of learning a complex sequence like reaching, grasping, and manipulating the object. And the type of stimulus also matters. So learning can be driven by external cues, say a visual or maybe a auditory signal, or by internal motivation also, like the person's own attempt to solve that particular task. So depending on these factors, different behavioral and neural mechanisms get engaged. So, in a way, we can say that the rehabilitation is not just about repeating the movements. It's about carefully designing the task and the environment so that the brain can relearn and adapt through the right learning mechanism. So now if we see the important concept in learning within the central nervous system, within the CNS, that is the motor adaptation. So when we say learning in CNS, we usually think about acquiring new skills or maybe new knowledge. But motor adaptation is very special form of learning. It's the brain and the spinal cord's ability to adjust our movements in response to either change in the environment or disturbances that affects our body. So in simple words, if we say, it's how we refine our movements so that they become more accurate and more efficient over time. So let's think about when we first try to use a new tool, or let's say when uh, you are walking on a very slippery surface, your initial movements are very clumsy or maybe inaccurate. But as you repeat the task, your nervous system adapts. It learns from the error and gradually optimize your actions. So that process is actually motor adaptation. Now, motor adaptation comes into two major forms. One is the error driven adaptation, and the second one is perturbation based adaptation. So in error based adaptation, uh, this happens when there is a mismatch between what you expected to happen and what actually happened. So the CNS, the central nervous system, detects that error and corrects itself in next trial. So for example, suppose if I ask you to reach for a target on a table, so on your first attempt, you may overshoot the target. So the CNS, the central nervous system, will uh, notices that error and adjust. So on the second attempt, maybe the error will be minimized or you may undershoot. So again, the CNS, the central nervous system, learns and refine. So maybe by the third or the fourth event, you are landing at right corner of the target or maybe center of the target. So this is your nervous system continuously updating motor commands to minimize the error. Now comes to the second type of adaptation, that is perturbation based adaptation. So in perturbation based adaptation, the challenge comes from your own error. Actually, in first case, we have seen that error we can minimize. So in this perturbation based adaptation, the external disturbances are more prominent as compared to your own error. So the challenge is not coming from your own error, but actually it is coming from the external disturbances. So we can take example like, let's say you are reaching to some target and suddenly someone applies a gentle push to your hand. So your movement get perturbed or disturbed. And what does your CNS do? The central nervous system do? It quickly detects the disturbance and compensates by generating counter force. So with practice, your brain becomes even better and more resistant towards that perturbation, and you can still reach the target smoothly despite of all these interferences. So both these processes, the error driven and the perturbation based adaptation, it depend on the coordination of several brain regions, and most importantly the cerebellum and the motor cortex. So we can say like the cerebellum is like a error detector. It compares the intended movement with actual feedback, while the motor cortex actually updates the motor command as per the generated error. So, in a way, we know that this learning process or motor adaptation is a lifelong process. Every time we interact with a new environment or face new challenges, our central nervous system CNS adapts to maintain precision control as well as the stability. And especially in rehabilitation and more specifically after the brain injury or spinal cord injury, we try to harness these same mechanism for the training of the brain to relearn and readjust movement in order to regain the lost functions. So now if you see, there is another most important form of learning in the CNS, the central nervous system, is associative learning. So what exactly that associative learning is? So associative learning is the process where our brain links two events together. In other words, when one event happens, we automatically expect another event to follow. And as a result, our behavior or our perception changes. So there are two major types of associative learning, the classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So if you see the classical conditioning, so most probably you may have heard about the uh, Pavlov famous experiment with the dogs. So normally dog show the urge of food as soon as they see the food. So that is natural and that's involuntary. But what the researcher did, they started ringing a bell every time he gave the food to the dog. And after several repetitions, something very interesting happened. Even if there is no food, the sound of the bell alone made the dog showing the urge for the food. And why? Because the brain had formed the association. Bell means food. So here, the bell, which was originally natural, became a conditioned stimuli, and the salvation became the conditioned response. So this shows how a simple pairing of stimuli can change the behavior. So now if we see the second type of learning, that is operant conditioning. So it is also sometimes called the instrumental conditioning. So this is slightly different. So instead of pairing two stimuli, here we are thinking behavior with a consequence. So the classic example is the example of rats that has been done by the researcher. So inside a special box, a rat there is a lever that the rat can press, and whenever it press the lever, it receives the food. So at first the rat pressed it by accident, but soon the rat realized that pressing of that lever is equivalent to getting a reward. So the rat started pressing. Okay, so now let's talk about the motor learning. So the motor learning is again a fascinating process in the CNS. It's especially how we acquire and how we refine the motor skills through practice and the experience. So this can be a simple learning as, let's say, for walking, or maybe a complex learning mastering a musical instrument or performing a precise surgical procedure also. So one important point is that motor learning happens on different time scales. Sometimes we see very rapid improvements in performance in short term, but those may fade if we stop practicing. At the other side, sometimes the motor learning becomes more of a long lasting, so almost permanent, because the brain has undergone structural and functional changes to reinforce those skills. So this process is possible because of neuroplasticity. So the brain, as we know, the brain has the ability to reorganize and strengthen its motor pathways based on the experience and repeated use. So now um, there are two key types of motor learning that we can highlight. The first is the feedback or reward driven motor learning. So in this type, feedback, either positive or negative, guides the behavior. For example, when you hit the target correctly in any task, that success acts as a reward, and the brain uh, uh, straighten the pathway that produced it. So if you make an error, the negative feedback reduces the likelihood of repeating that movement. So the basal ganglia and the dopamine reward pathways are very important in this form of learning. The second type of motor learning can be implicit motor learning. That is learning that happens without consciousness or without conscious awareness. So small gradual improvements occur automatically as we keep repeating the movement. So we can think about riding a bicycle. So you don't know consciously, think about all the adjustment your body is making to keep balance. Yet over time you get it better and better. So the cerebellum plays a major role here, especially in fine-tuning movements and correcting the error. So if we say overall, motor learning is not just one process. It is collection of overlapping mechanisms driven by reinforcement, feedback, and subconsciousness fine-tuning. And it makes it a we can say a powerful tool in rehabilitation, especially after brain or maybe a spinal cord injury, where patient often needs to relearn motor skill through structured practice. So, to really understand motor learning, we also need to look at the neural structures that make it possible. So, different area of the brain contribute in unique ways. So, first, let's say the cerebellum. So, the cerebellum is absolute essential for motor coordination and precision. We may think of it as a brain's error detector. So whenever we perform a movement, the cerebellum compares what we intended to do and what actually happened. If there is any mismatch, it helps to correct and fine tune the movement. And this is why damage of the cerebellum often leads to problem with balance and accuracy. Next, we have the basal ganglia. So the basal ganglia play a critical role in procedural learning, that is learning skill through practice and repetitions. So they are particularly important in habit formation and refining skills that eventually become automatic. So for example, when you learn to play a piano piece, the basal ganglia help uh, shift those movements from conscious effort to smooth and habitual performance. And another key player in this is the primary motor cortex, or sometimes we also name it as M1. So this area is very active in the early stage of motor learning when we are first acquiring a new motor skill, like learning how to swing a tennis racket. The primary motor cortex helps us to generate the basic movement pattern. And finally, we have the supplementary motor area, also known as SMA, and the pre-motor cortex. So these regions comes into picture when we need to plan the sequence of a more complex movements. So they are responsible for higher order planning, coordinating movements that involves multiple steps or multiple parts of the body. So for example, planning of sequence of reaching, grasping, or and lifting any object. So the primary motor cortex along with the supplementary motor area and the premotor cortex will be involved in these activities. So when we talk about motor learning, it's not only single brain regions that works. Instead, there is a network, the cerebellum for error correction, the basal ganglia for habit formation, the motor cortex for skill acquisition, the premotor areas for complex planning. All these areas work together to make learning and refining movement actually make it possible. So now let's talk about the mechanism of neuroplasticity, both in learning and after brain injury. So when we say neuroplasticity, we are really thinking or maybe talking about the brain's ability to reorganize and adapt, whether that's a response to a new experiences in learning a new skill or in recovering after damage, such as a stroke or spinal cord injury. So one of the most important mechanism here is gene expression. So what is gene expression? So gene expression is basically the process where genetic information is turned into functional proteins that actually influence how our nervous or our neurons behaves. And in the brain, this is not a passive process. It changes dynamically with learning and experience. So, for example, in motor skill learning, gen expression in the primary motor cortex is absolutely critical. If we formologically block this expression, the ability to learn new movements is uh, maybe completely stopped or disastrously reduced. So what's fascinating is that this gen and the protein expression does not just occur during practice, it also happens afterwards when the subject is at rest. So this delay synthesizes, supports what we call intersession consolidation, meaning the brain is still working for stabilizing and strengthening what we have learned even when the practice is over. So a class of gens called immediate early gens or IEG. These are especially important here. Let's say, for instance, the gen arc is expressed in the motor cortex specifically during skill learning, but not during simple repetitive movement that does not involve learning. So, in short, we can say that the gen expressions provide the molecular foundation for neuroplasticity. It allows neurons to form new synapses, strengthening the existing ones, and basically rewire themselves to support both new learning as well as the recovery after the damage. So now if we see at cellular level, the neuroplasticity is actually driven by the changes in the structure and function of the neurons themselves. So one of the most important process here is dendritic urbanization. So in simple term, if we see this term, this is where nervous system grows new branches, forming additional synaptic connections. So these new connections provide the physical network through which new learning and recovery can occur. So alongside this new structural growth, there are also important functional changes at the synapses. And these functional changes we can classify into two key mechanisms. So one is long-term potentiation, that is LTP, and the other one is long-term depression, that is LTD. So the long-term potentiation, that is LTP, refers to the strengthening of synapses after repeated or patterned activities, making communication between neurons more efficient. And the LTD, that is the long-term depression, is the opposite of LTP. So it actually weakens the synapses when certain patterns of low frequency activity occurs. So together, this LTP and LTD acts as a cellular equivalence of learning and the memory. So in motor system, let's say for example, repetitive practice of movement can seen as equivalent to introducing LTP, gradually making the connections with the synapses in motor cortex more stronger. And interestingly, research have shown that once the motor skill is learned, the capacity of LTP and the LTD in that area becomes temporarily reduced. So almost as if the brain's plasticity has been used up for consolidation of the memory for that particular skill. And over time, though this ability recovers, but now on top of an already existing synaptic connections, or maybe we can take it as a baseline. So this actually suggests that LTP and LTD helps form the memory tracks for the movement. And we also know that the structural remodeling happens during the motor uh, skill learning. So dendrites, both uh, apical and the basal, actually expand, and this changes is specific to the neurons controlling the muscles used in training, but not to uh, relate it like if a particular neurons is connected to particular, let's say the muscle, so it will work for that, but not for the unrelated muscles. So this actually highlights how precise and task specific plasticity can be possible. And now if we shift to from normal learning to recovery based learning after the brain on the spinal cord injury, things becomes more complex. And some studies suggest that LTP in the peri-infrared cortex, that's the region surrounding an injured area, appears to be facilitated. So this is somewhat we can say unexpected, since in healthy skill learning the LTP is reduced after use, but because these studies don't always account for let's say the lesion size or recovery outcomes, direct comparisons is not possible or little bit tricky. So in humans, however, preliminary evidence is encouraging. For example, LTP like affected uh, introduced by repetitive uh, transcranial magnetic stimulation, or we say TMS, in the motor cortex of the injured hemisphere have been shown to predict better recovery 6 months later. So, and similarly, paired associative stimulation, a method combining peripheral nerve stimulation with TMS, can elicit the associative LTP in the affected hemisphere, particularly in patients with less severe deficits. So, if we sum up, we can say that the cellular level recovery and learning both depends on fine-tuning mechanisms like dendrite branching, synaptic remodeling, and process such as LTP and the LTD. And these mechanisms not only support motor skills but also hold promise for guiding rehabilitation strategies after brain or maybe spinal cord injury. So let's move on to another important level of neuroplasticity, systems plasticity in the brain. So this refers to change not just at the level of individual neurons or synapses, but across entire networks and circuits in the brain. So when we repeatedly activate certain neural pathways during learning, those circuits become uh, stronger and more efficient, allowing the brain to perform a specific task with great precision. We can see this process very clearly in patients recovering from the stroke. At first, the motor cortex is damaged. The brain tries to compensate by recruiting larger brain regions, not just the motor cortex, but also the surrounding areas. And this is the something we can visualize using the fMRI scans. Initially, you see widespread activation, almost like the brain is searching for the alternative routes to perform that particular movement. And if the primary cortex itself is damaged, the brain often shifts activity to the nearby uh, areas or even the premotor cortex. So over time, if recovery is successful, this widespread hyperactivation gradually sinks, activity becomes more focused again, especially in the motor regions of the damaged hemisphere. Um, and that's actually a good sign. The brain is actually reorganizing efficiently. But in patients, when recovery is poor, the story is uh, kind of different. The hyperactivity tends to persist in both the affected area and the non-affected areas of the brain. And this can be interpreted as the brain's continuous but unsuccessful attempt of re-establishing the motor control. So the recovery is not only about the cortex. The cerebellum also play a important role. Better recovery outcomes have been linked to increased activation in the cerebellum on the same side of the moving limb, along with decreased activation in the opposite cerebellum. And actually, this highlights how distributed brain regions adapt together during rehabilitation. And another key observation is that stroke affects actually the connectivity, that is the communication between the brain regions. So not only do areas near the affected region connections, but even intact areas in the opposite hemisphere shows the reduced connectivity. So for example, if uh, interhemispheric communication between two primary motor cortex uh, we observe, it becomes impaired. And finally, while imagining uh, through all those images taken from the brain or the brain imaging analysis, if we see, so this actually tells us which area is actually active. And techniques like TMS gives us more direct measures of the functional recovery. So now let's look at the subcortical contribution to movement learning. So when we talk about learning after the stroke or any injury, we often emphasize the role of the cortex. But it's important to remember that subcortical structure, especially the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, also play a important role. So the basal ganglia are heavily involved in forming habit and the procedural learning. In other words, they help us acquire and fine tune the motor skills through repetition. They also play a role in selecting which motor program to execute, reinforce movements that are successful, and gradually suppressing those movements that are less effective. So after an injury, this reinforcement mechanism becomes very valuable because the basal ganglia can help strengthening the alternate pathways that allows the individual to compensate for the lost functions. Whereas on the other hand, the cerebellum is like the brain error detector or error checking system. It constantly compares the intended movement with the actual movement, and when there is a mismatch, it generates a corrective signal. So this feedback allows us to refine and improve motor coordination, timing, and precision. So now let's talk about an area which often underestimated when we are discussing the neuroplasticity, that is the spinal cord. So we usually think of spinal cord is just a pathway carrying the message back and forth between the brain and the body, but in reality, it is much more dynamic. So the spinal cord itself is capable of plastic changes both after injury and in response to the learning. So for example, let's say following a spinal cord injury, the nervous system sometimes form new connections around the damaged site. And these reorganizations may not fully restore the function, but they can allow for some degree of recovery, helping the patient regain partial movement or reflexes. And one key aspect here is that what we call as a spinal reflex plasticity. So reflexes, as we know, are automatic responses that don't require conscious control. So the spinal cord is central to generate these reflexes. So after injury or even during certain kinds of motor learning, the excitability of reflex circuit can actually be modified. This means reflexes can become stronger, weaker, or even adapt to new motor pattern. And another dimension of this task-specific plasticity is the nervous system doesn't just adapt randomly; it adapts in a way that is directly tied to what the body is actually practicing or learning. So we can take example like someone learning to play musical instrument. So with repeated practice, the motor and the sensory regions that support finger movements and auditory feedback expand. And similarly, in rehabilitation, when patient repeat a certain task like grasping an object, the spinal and cortical circuits related to that specific task adapt to make the movement more efficient over time. So the spinal cord is not a passive player. It is actually active player. It actively participate in recovery and learning, showing that plasticity uh, truly exists at multiple levels of the nervous system. So now, as we know that the spinal cord is not just a passive relay for information passing between the brain and the body, it actually adapt and change, showing its own form of plasticity. So one of the best example for this is the that we have seen is the reflex plasticity. So reflexes, again, we already know that uh, these are the automatic and rapid responses like the knee jerk reflexes. So this reflex is controlled through a monosynaptic reflex arc where a sensory neuron from the muscle spindle directly connects to a motor neuron in the spinal cord that produces a immediate contraction. And what is fascinating is that these reflexes pathways can be modified through training and repetitive stimulation. For example, experiments have shown that even when the spinal cord is completely disconnected from the brain, what we call a uh, transection, reflex responses can still be there, or reflex responses can still be conditioned. And this process, known as the spinal reflex conditioning, enhance the motor response after repeated stimulation. So the persistence of these training effects even after uh, disconnection between the spinal cord and the brain. Now, if you see the task-specific plasticity in the spinal cord, so actually this task-specific plasticity in the spinal cord refers to the ability of the spinal cord circuits to adapt and reorganize its um, pathways or in a way that is specific to the demand of a particular motor task. Or we can say in other words, we keep repeating or keep repeating a certain task, the spinal cord learns to fine tune its activity for that particular task. So a major role here is played by the inhibitory neurotransmitter system, especially the GABA system. The spinal cord contains the spinal cord contains interneurons that release glycinic and GABA. So, and these chemicals are actually inhibitory. So that means their job is to block or reduce the transmission of signals, and which helps in controlling the motor neurons activity and shaping smooth coordinated movement. So now let's say during task specific plasticity, the efficiency of these inhibitory pathways can actually change depending on what the task demands. So we can think of a learning of, let's say, riding a bicycle. At first, your movements are uncoordinated. You struggle to balance, steer, and pedal at the same time. But with repetitive practice, the spinal cord adjusts. The inhibitory pathways becomes fine-tuned so that the unnecessary muscle activations are suppressed and the right set of muscles work together and form a more smooth um, activity coordination. So task specific plasticity in the spinal cord is like an internal adjustment system. Through repeated task performance, the spinal cord modify its inhibitory circuit to allow precise motor control. And this is an important principle in motor learning and also in rehabilitation, because the more a person practice a specific movement, the more the spinal circuit adapts to make that movement efficient and coordinated. So I hope you have gained a clear understanding of the learning of damaged brain or spinal cord neuroplasticity. So I look forward to continue learning with all together, and thank you all for joining this session.